choose problem solving, we'll be looking at step 2, the underlying problem in this section. Obviously, the students have already completed step 1, identification of challenges, and have generated 16, hopefully, 16 different ideas and challenges from the future scene. They're going to move forward and take those challenge ideas and look at identifying an important part of the future scene and establishing goals for the remainder of the problem-solving process. The underlying problem is scored in several manners, the first of which is the structure, and then the structure, which looks at how they constructed their underlying problem. It's not necessarily about the quality of the goals they've established, but simply have they included all elements in the appropriate manner. Their second part is looking at the focus. How have they narrowed or broadened the scope of the issue to be considered? Third is adequacy. How significant of an impact will these goals have if solved? What will their impact be on the entire future scene as a whole? And then, of course, as always, feedback to the students about their effective communication skills and the goals that they've established in the underlying problem. So for scoring, we have that structure, which there's multiple components that are taken into account, and it's whether or not they are present. The second is that scope, just mentioned, which is eligible for up to 10 points awarded for the manageability of their goals. The adequacy is the importance of the underlying problem and is also eligible for up to 10 points, given the impact it could have on the future scene, for a total of 30 points eligible in step 2. So the structure, as we mentioned, it's what they have concluded. The first part is going to be that condition phrase, which serves as a lead-in fact that describes the situation. It serves as the connection to the future scene and offers an opportunity for the students to provide the reason why they have selected the underlying problem that they're about to establish. The STEM and KVP, or key verb phrase, the STEM is how might we, or in what ways might we, are the most traditionally used, though it's possible students could use an alternate phrase. And then an active verb, which here they're going to look at whether it's a single verb establishing one goal, and then the purpose, specifying a reason for solving the challenge, and then future scene parameters. These are items that place the underlying problem within the situation provided to them in the future scene. So that lead-in fact or logical extension from the future scene can be also incorporate students' research. And 2 points are awarded if it's both present and uses accurate information and connects to the future scene. We mentioned before the idea of de-extinction as a topic. If they mention that de-extinction isn't even an issue anymore, obviously that would not be a logical and appropriate use of information. So it would score 1 point given the future scene. It's present, but it's not appropriate or accurate. The only way they would receive 0 points in this area is if they did not include a condition phrase. Condition phrases often vary a great deal based on the skill level of the team and can be very simple in what they present, but still accurate and relevant, or they can often, especially you'll see in the senior teams, very elaborated, a much longer explanation where they really strive to incorporate the research and the reasoning and can really bolster the thought process that led them to the selection of their goals. So in the next part of this is that STEM and key verb phrase. The key verb phrase identifies the primary action goal from the future scene for their solutions and the remainder of their booklet to address. And so they want to identify a single goal. Whenever they include multiple goals, each of those following solutions will be required to accomplish both things. And so it really, they have not successfully narrowed their thinking to identify a singular opportunity to singular goal to address. And so that's where this comes into play. Also, they sometimes add multiple objects or modifiers, which reduces how effectively they've narrowed their thinking. In the next part, it's the purpose, which offers that why they wanted to do this. So they wanted to increase the presence of predatory animals to help maintain the biosphere. So it's the help maintain is their purpose, whereas the increase the number of predatory animals serves as their key verb phrase. And it's the two together that identify the goals and the reason for accomplishing that goal in the solutions. And there is a difference in how if the students fail to provide a purpose, yes, it will be scored as 0 and not present. However, in practice problems, those non-competitive rounds, evaluators are going to impose a logical purpose so that the remainder of the booklet can be scored. And this is outlined specifically in the evaluation guidelines, so please be sure to reference that if you encounter this situation. But it's the idea that in order for solutions to be scored, there has to be a purpose and a reason that those goals in the key verb phrase were pursued. Therefore, an evaluator imposes a logical purpose, but you do so without reading the solutions. You don't want to read ahead and go, oh, now I know what they meant to say, but rather taking the information you have in the condition phrase and the key verb phrase and making an appropriate assumption as to what their reasoning is, not being overly harsh and making it a very narrow and difficult task, but at the same time not opening it up to where it's so big and broad that every item they could ever come up with would receive credit. But it's important to note in those non-competitive books, if this is the case, that that is not how it will be handled once they reach the competitive levels. So for qualifying problem, affiliate competition, national finals, international conference, those competitive levels, if students have failed to include a purpose, they receive 0 points here, but they also do not have one imposed, which makes it extremely difficult for them to earn any points in the remaining steps of the process. Last but not least with the structure, you're looking to identify the future scene parameters, which in some ways these may seem very obvious. The topic, we know it's the extinction. The place, they indicate that future scene indicates it was the Siberian plateau. It might be the moon, it might be worldwide, depending on how the future scene is written. And then also the time. But the significance of these, both for scoring an underlying problem, but also for students, is to help with their thinking process. These make sure that they have actually focused their goals within the future scene and haven't moved outside of the scope of that future scene, which could occur if they had read some research and were particularly excited about one avenue of what was going to be happening with a topic, and then the future scene was not focused on that topic or that angle of the topic, and yet they decided to pursue it anyway. And so these really help the students to root their thinking in addressing the future scene. Before we move on to focus, are there any questions in terms of the structural aspects of an underlying problem?
I think we have the basics.
All right. So focus is where, now that we've identified all the pieces and parts that have been included, we're going to look at the scope of the underlying problem. You can see here an excerpt from the score sheet indicating the 1 through 10 scale, but the focus is looking at how the UP has set a measurable goal. And it needs to narrow the future scene, however, it should do so without trivializing it. And it's going to be derived or inspired from possibly a single challenge in step 1, or it might be a group of challenges. If the team identified multiple business commerce challenges in step 1, that might be an area that they would develop an overarching business commerce style underlying problem. It's also important to recognize whether or not they would be able to accomplish this goal. Setting goals such as solving world hunger obviously are very well intentioned and would be an exceptional thing to accomplish. But identifying ways to help the hungry in your community is a much more manageable goal that would help you reach the ultimate goal. And so it's identifying how big of an issue. Oftentimes coaches will recommend to students, and evaluators might want to think in this manner: how big a piece of cake or pie have you selected? You want enough to enjoy and be satisfied with, but if you take the whole thing, it's much more than you can handle. And so it's picking that manageable and measurable option. And so it's also important that focus takes into account both the key verb phrase and the purpose. And so in situations where the purpose and the key verb phrase don't have a logical connection, it's going to score rather weakly, as you can see here on this rubric. But when they're connected very effectively, and it's evident that it's an appropriate size goal and that the key verb phrase, if accomplished, logically leads to the completion of the purpose, it's going to be much more strong on that focus aspect. The second part is the adequacy, which takes into account the significance and the impact of their goals, which in the evaluation notes provided for each future scene, there's a rubric included that provides potential key verb phrases based on the future scene, and it really ties in directly with what we refer to often as the charge, or you may refer to it as the directive or the call to action that's provided in the lower portion of the future scene. This is where they're given that specific goal that they're asked to consider. They may have looked at a future scene that's talking about a new colony being established on Mars. And so if it's as broad as help the new residents, then there's many different avenues they could look at. But at the same time, identifying what that charge says is important for the teams and the evaluators, because they might be looking at a colony on Mars, but specifically told to focus on providing basic needs or concerns about communication with the overarching government structure for that colony. So this is where you want to take a close look at that rubric provided in the evaluation notes. And it's especially important that getting a group of evaluators together, we've mentioned before that evaluators should be collaborative, and that's not in every single item of scoring, but sitting down before scoring step 2, before scoring booklets, to discuss that rubric so that everyone can be moving forward from the same ideas and concepts and work together to review them and come to agreement as to how different potential underlying problems would be scored to improve consistency. Because one thing very important about step 2 is the remainder of the booklet does depend on those ideas identified here. And there are serious repercussions for the student's opportunity to earn points if there is a major error in step 2. So it's very important, because especially in competitive rounds where there's multiple evaluations for a booklet, it can often be a fine line between an underlying problem being excellent or very difficult to understand. And some of those common concerns here, like the idea that they included multiple key verb phrases or purposes. They've set up multiple goals, which means that each solution would need to accomplish each of these to receive credit. Now, the idea of a restatement is taking something that would capture all the problems within the future scene, so that they haven't narrowed their focus to a specific issue or challenge identified in the future scene, but rather are looking at fixing every challenge they've found in the future scene. How can we make the colony on Mars successful, rather than how can we help that colony communicate with other colonies or with the transport shuttles or something of that nature. Rather a piece of the pie, but they've taken the entire pie on to try and address it. Broadening would be the type of situation where, yes, the future scene is entirely about a colony on Mars, but for some reason, they have decided that they're really concerned about how this situation is going to impact the meat packers union back on Earth. There's no logical connection. They have moved outside of that scope of the future scene, which is where the issue of those future scene parameters we just discussed comes into play. If they're not operating within the time, the place, the topic of the future scene, it's very likely that they have, in fact, broadened their goals and moved beyond the situation they've been asked to analyze. We addressed the issue earlier of no purpose and how it is handled differently in the two sets of competitions, either non-competitive practice problems or competitive. And then another potential issue is that the key verb phrase and the purpose are the same. We often refer to them as being a circular underlying problem. How can we increase the amount of food that people have to eat so that people have enough food to eat? That the purpose doesn't offer a reason for the key verb phrase to occur, but instead it just restates it. They've gone into a track of circular thinking, and that automatically is going to score them much more severely on those scales. So do we have any questions at this point?
I think we're good with that. We want to make sure that we can establish some form of communication among our judges, our evaluators, to make their evaluations more consistent.
And that's absolutely a really important thing. I know often, depending on how groups evaluate, because certainly there's, groups that get together in one specific location physically, review evaluation notes, and then disperse. Or it's also common for evaluation groups to have, a webinar, a conference call, something of that nature, to just have their evaluation coordinator or lead evaluator, as the case may be, make sure that each evaluator has been provided the evaluation notes in advance and have that opportunity for the discussion, which in the evaluation notes, there's that rubric that was mentioned, which can be very helpful. There also are sample underlying problems and potential scores and explanation for those scores, because giving feedback to students, of course, is very important. And so being able to say, oh, you did a great job in responding to the charge, this would significantly impact the future scene, it is a great thing. But also focus and adequacy, while they're different items, are often at least connected. If you haven't focused well on the future scene, you aren't going to be identifying an adequate or significant issue. And so it's not that focus and adequacy scores are always the same, that if you get a 7 on focus, you'll get a 7 on adequacy. But it might be they selected a significant issue, but perhaps approached it with a broad perspective of the people they're involving, or the scope of the area in which they're going to try and implement it. So it might score well on adequacy, but not as strongly on the focus. And having the opportunity for evaluators to read those sample underlying problems and the explanation of their scores, and then discuss them. And it's very common for the group of evaluators to sit down and go, oh, well, we agree with, the first 4 UPs and how they're scored, but number 5, I don't understand the reason for that. Have a discussion and decide that as a group they are going to adjust the scoring there. And also on these rubrics, there are ranges, because it's a rubric that it's the idea of what a 9 or 10 would adequacy score would look like, what a 7, 8 would look like, what a 4, 5, or 6 would look like. because the way you read the condition phrase and the way someone else reads the condition phrase, given your nature and your background on a topic, could influence how you score. So for consistency, having evaluator communication, especially in terms of the underlying problem, is very helpful.
Okay.
All right. So we'll go ahead and review step 2. So first of all, it's that structure where we're not looking at whether it's a significant issue or an important issue or big or small, but have they included all the pieces. Next, it's that focus, the scope or manageability of the issue. That idea of, did they bite off more than they could chew, or did they take such a small and narrow piece that it really would be difficult, or it would be so simple for them to address that it might not actually impact the future scene. And then, of course, there's the adequacy. How big of an impact would this have on the future scene? And this ties it into that charge provided and how, if it was solved, what kind of impact it would have. And then, of course, the feedback element. What about their score created, what about their UP maybe either won them points or might have lost them some points? And it's very important, especially in practice problems. It's a very common technique for experienced evaluators to take the ideas presented in a less successful underlying problem and take those same ideas and provide an example or a model for the students to work on. You said this in your key verb phrase and that in your purpose, but I think it might be more effective if you had phrased it this way, and provide that model for the students using their own ideas. That's a very common evaluation technique, especially from internationally certified and experienced evaluators in the practice problems. Obviously, as the rounds of competition proceed, the feedback is still important, but it becomes less in terms of teaching students the process and more of explaining the scores themselves or the decisions made. Okay, before we conclude step 2, are there any final questions?
No, I think we're good.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, and we'll go ahead and conclude the step 2 section at this time.